Good afternoon, and welcome to the third meeting of the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, VIII, which I formally declare open. I ask that everyone turn off their video and microphones unless you are speaking. I would like to start the meeting by acknowledging the passing of longtime CSRIC member and contributor John Kimmons. John was an important member of many years, and he will be missed. Today, we will hear first from the new chief of the FCC's Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau, Deb Jordan, and then from the CSRIC VIII co-chair, Nazrin Razai of Verizon, and then each of the 6 working groups on their progress thus far. Deb?
Deb, you are on mute.
Oops, but welcome and thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Some of you may not know, I became chair of the Bureau just 2 months ago. And so this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to open one of your meetings, and I'm honored to be here. Having served previously as a deputy chief of the Bureau with a large focus on cybersecurity, disaster response, and intergovernmental coordination, I'm well aware of the expertise assembled here from the full range of stakeholders and the significance of the tasks before you. As you all know, CSRIC VIII is tackling issues necessary to promote the secure and reliable 5G networks. You're also developing recommendations to ensure the security of 5G signaling protocols, of Open RAN equipment, of virtualized technology, and of the software and cloud services supply chain. Simply put, this is important stuff. I can't overemphasize in my work with the national security folks how important the work you're doing is, and especially with Open RAN, that we think is going to be so important to make sure we get it right and get it secure. CSRIC is also working on recommendations to make public safety and emergency services more reliable for all Americans. And the Commission has asked you to examine the feasibility of expanding the availability of Wi-Fi and/or unlicensed spectrum in order to facilitate access to 911 services. You're also tasked with developing requirements that help leverage mobile device application and firmware to enhance wireless emergency alerts for the public. Again, really important stuff. I recognize the level of expertise required to address these topics and put a great deal of trust in all of you to help us find the best way forward. The chairwoman has tasked you all with these critical issues, and in accordance with the Federal Advisory Committee Act, we recognize that you must be free to work without interference or pressure to choose any particular path or solution. I urge you all to stay on the course and persevere, knowing that we truly value your free and independent participation, the expression of different viewpoints and ideas, and the robust deliberation among committee members. Thank you all for your time and for serving this really important purpose. Suzanne, back to you.
Thank you. I believe that Nazrin, you're next.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our third session. As I have had a chance to review some of the pre-read materials, looks like all working group at a good stage of doing some good benchmarking, review of previous CSRIC working group committee content and material and recommendations, and really good set of update and reporting today. I urge all the co-chairs and co-leaders to identify to us any maybe interdependency or matters or issues that we potentially at this level need to collectively discuss. So I appreciate all of your participation, and I will ask to pass it on to the first group to do their debrief. Thank you.
That would be John Rose.
Sure, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, if we can jump to the first slide. So John Rose from Dell and Michaela from Microsoft are the two co-chairs for Working Group 3. By the way, we appreciate the flexibility on schedules to go first, and the unavoidable conflict. We'll go through very quickly the objectives of the working group and our status to date, and glad to answer any questions. To remind everybody, the focus of Work Group 3 has two deliverables, one in December of 22 around a report on how virtualized technologies can be used to promote 5G security and reliability. And the other is a report on the recommendation and roles of the FCC in promoting the availability of standards for more secure, reliable 5G environment through the use of virtualization technology. The core theme in Work Group 3 is the application of virtualization to the telecom ecosystem and ultimately its implications and advantages. Next chart. So our objectives are listed here. Obviously, like most of the working groups, we are going to gather a significant amount of information from industry, academia, governmental entities, et cetera, on this topic. We will go through analysis of what we've heard, and we're already seeing some interesting trends materialize, and then ultimately, convert that into the two documents I just mentioned that hopefully will provide guidance and insight that are helpful for establishing best practices and ultimately policy. Next chart. So our timeline, we began in late last year. We are currently in the information gathering phase, even though it's very likely we'll gather information throughout the entire process. But our first priority was getting subject matter experts in to share with us their views on the application of virtualization in telecom and 5G specifically. We expect that to largely have enough of a corpus of work to begin creating a outline of the ultimate paper, the first paper that's due in December, sometime early summer. We will then delegate that work out to the working group. We have a very strong working group with good diversity, so we should be able to assemble a series of drafts, ultimately edit them, socialize them with the broader CSRIC organization, and our expectation is we should be on track to hit our first deliverable in December 2022, and then begin work on the second document, which will build on the first one for delivery next year. Next chart. Okay, let me take a few minutes to walk you through a high-level summary of each of the subject matter experts that we've had come in to date. There's a lot more material that was presented, but capture the highlights just so people understand the kind of dialogues that we're having and the information that's starting to flow in. So next chart, please. So our first presenter, Dr. Jagannath and Kayvon, the topic was Wi-Fi and 5G coexistence. It turns out, obviously both technologies are leveraging virtualization in various forms. And so their discussion really focused on the security vulnerabilities in the current 5G and Wi-Fi environments. We had good, healthy discussions around the virtualized RAN and virtualized core differentiation and how to think about those two areas. Virtualization of the access network does seem to become a more pervasive issue given the types of access technologies, especially with unlicensed band Wi-Fi and licensed 5G coexisting. Spectrum sharing has come up a number of times. We're debating, is that part of virtualization or something else, but it is definitely attached to the use of virtual resources, in this case, spectrum. 5G coexistence and new vulnerabilities, obviously, as we bring in coexistence models that include virtualization as underlying technologies, you have an intersection of domains which creates new, potentially unseen vulnerabilities or risks. And then another topic that was covered was Wi-Fi offloading, which is the idea that the Wi-Fi network is not completely independent of the cellular environment. In fact, may be part of it, and you could expect that certain user traffic, voice traffic, and others may in fact flow partially over a Wi-Fi network. So when we contemplate security in these virtualized environments, the coexistence and the fact that Wi-Fi may be part of it is actually important. That was one of the observations from this presentation. Next chart. Okay, so next chart was New York University Wireless. It was a number of folks, including Sandeep and Siddharth. This is primarily an academic organization that they brought in their 5G security work. It was a very interesting discussion. It's helped us establish a fairly good list of vulnerabilities to consider in virtualized environments. That list continues to grow with other dialogues that we are having. There was a significant discussion around user plane vulnerabilities. I think the industry does a reasonably good job on data plane, but user plane is an area that in many cases is an optional area to cover by the operator, but yet is a significant one when we start to think about the overall security model. They obviously recommended that there are areas to focus on looking forward, given that they're a research organization. User plane integrity protection, enhanced subscriber privacy, interconnection security, and NAS messaging protection. So this has, again, helped us develop a fairly comprehensive list of potential vulnerabilities and risks associated with these environments. And then ultimately we will map which of those risks are actually tied to the use of virtualization in the cellular environment. Next chart. Our third presenter is Ian Levy from the National Cybersecurity Center of the United Kingdom. Many of you probably know Ian. He's well known in this space. He shared a wide-ranging set of observations about the use of virtualization and the changes in the telecom environment. One thing that we did realize in our discussions with him is that there are similar efforts going on around the world. The TSRs in the UK, the 5G toolbox in the EU, all touch on potential risks and risk mitigation for virtualized next generation advanced wireless environments. So we do believe that understanding those, capturing them, and using them as potential reference is useful. There was a very good discussion about the reason why virtualization exists. It does, in fact, give us new security paradigms, but it also adds to robustness and resiliency of the system. Ian and team have spent a great deal of time evaluating the different kinds of virtualization, VMs versus containers versus other aspects of virtualization and the security risks associated with them. So he shared his observations on that. He did focus very heavily, though, on some advice thinking about how to assure compliance. The compliance regime is sometimes as difficult as deciding what the policies and best practices should be. We're not sure if that's in scope or not, but we did feel it was a very useful conversation. And then obviously, when we think about virtualization, it is a different supply chain. And so we had a long discussion around knowing and understanding that the supply chain for a virtualized cellular environment does not entirely originate with telecom providers. It, in fact, comes out of the IT and cloud ecosystem. And so he gave us a recommendation, which we are doing, to make sure we spend quality time with the leaders in virtualization, VMware, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and others. So overall, very, very useful conversations. Next chart. And presentation 4 of the 4th session was around 5 Sukunair. Here, again, it continued to build on our list of security vulnerabilities that we should consider. He was very focused on 5G security as an end-to-end paradigm, and end-to-end can mean different things to different people, but definitely something we should attempt to clarify. He identified gaps that it is not sufficient just to authenticate servers. You really have to have kind of a full authentication model in the system, and other areas of interest for him were obviously taking apart the Genome B and understanding the implications of disaggregation. And then he was also the first to really spend quality time trying to map zero trust architectures to this kind of environment, which we think will be important as zero trust continues to be kind of the North Star for where people believe they can get ahead of the security risk profiles that are out there. Next chart. And then presentation 5 with Nagarinda. This discussion was bringing in some of the work in the Open RAN Security Alliance, Open RAN Alliance, and the security-specific focus there. We do believe that we did not have to repeat or duplicate the work that's been done in other organizations. So having the ORAN Alliance come in and share what they were working on was very helpful. They've done good comparison of RAN topologies from vRAN to traditional RAN to obviously moving to more disaggregated and open architectures. They have a fairly detailed view of RAN-specific landscape threats, which again continues to build on our list of potential vulnerabilities and areas that need to be addressed. And obviously they are continuing to do analysis of various aspects of the overall environment. So we do believe the Open RAN Alliance work should be a very good source of information, along with many other sources. But our attempt is to not duplicate what they're doing, but to draw from it. Obviously they have started to develop best security practices around Open RAN environments, but understanding that Open RAN and vRAN are not synonymous entirely. We believe virtualization is a superset, and while Open RAN environments are mostly virtualized, not all virtualized environments are Open RAN environments. So we will have to consider that difference. And last chart, next one. So some recurring themes that have come up to date as we're gathering data, obviously, that there are obviously a broad spectrum of attacks that need to be discussed, and we're collecting a broader view, which might be very good to correlate across the working groups. There definitely is a theme that the standards vulnerabilities due to legacy environments do carry forward. We can see a lot of vulnerabilities that was purely 5G in a vacuum we would not have to deal with, but because of it, we do need to consider. There's a healthy discussion around types of virtualization. Virtualization as a term is largely misunderstood in many cases, and it's important that we clarify it and describe the different dimensions of it and the forward-looking behaviors of it, because it will be a foundational technology. Supply chain issues, because the virtualized environments come from a much broader supply chain, both hardware and software. We need to contemplate that implication on the security and trust environment. And definitely compliance testing and configuration control is complex in this environment, given the diversity of technologies coming together. And then finally, zero trust is starting to become a repeated discussion that we'll have to contemplate how zero trust paradigms apply to the virtualized environment. They definitely do apply, and making it clear that there are best practices emerging elsewhere that should be applied here will probably be useful. There were some less occurring themes that we expected, and we did see some evidence of enforcement mechanisms. How do you make sure that the industry actually uses best practices and does not opt out? Incentives to encourage adoption of security proactively. The orchestration logic of the system. These are complex, orchestrated, virtualized, software-defined systems, so that can create another potential issue. Active mitigation methods around many of the security vulnerabilities are best dealt with proactively. And then obviously IT best practices are now very much required in a virtualized environment, because the baseline technology is generally coming out of the IT and cloud world, not necessarily the telecom world. And so understanding those and using them will be important in virtualized environments for security. I think that was it for our discussion. I'll just turn it over to Michaela real quickly and see if she has anything to add, but otherwise, hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you, John. Couple of things, and this was an excellent recap. We've been very busy with a lot of experts coming in, and we do have a few more experts on different security aspects that will be coming from Palo Alto, as well as Microsoft, and a few others that are scheduled. I would like to offer, I know that John has been passing, but I think it's we did discuss this, and we think it's very important to understand any overlap with other working groups, and would like to extend an invitation to discuss with all the working groups that feel we can provide some feedback back and forth, and see how we can make sure that we are not focusing on the same type of areas, as well as provide perhaps an invitation to the experts that we have seen so far. If you would like to invite them, we will be more than happy to provide the contact information. And I think that's all I wanted to add. So thank you very much.
Are there any questions? All right, if we could move on to Working Group 1, 5G Signaling Protocol Security.
There were hands raised, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
This is Stephen Hayes from Meriton. I had a question. I noticed in some of the presentations and also in sort of the themes that a lot of them weren't specific to virtualization, that they were more sort of general telecom type of vulnerabilities that might be experienced. How are you intending to focus down on the more virtualization related vulnerabilities? Is that the intention, or how exactly are you going to sort of
yes
boiling the ocean?
No, Yeah, it's a great question, because what we realized is virtualization doesn't exist in isolation. It's a technique used broadly across the telecom landscape. So many of the speakers, we asked them to come in and talk about telecom security and then try to narrow it to areas where virtualization is appropriate. Because of the nature of their presentations, many of them covered a superset. So for instance, in our threat management or threat list, where we're trying to aggregate the various threats that are coming forth in these discussions, in the matrix, we have a column that says, is this related to virtualization? Because as you rightly pointed out, we're clearly going to see lots of security risks associated with telecom. The question is, how many of them are actually tied to the use of virtualization? So we are attempting to narrow it down. The ultimate documentation at the end will be very specific to defining, understanding, characterizing, and mitigating and recommending mechanisms to mitigate risks associated very specifically with the use of virtualization. So we'll hopefully narrow it down. The challenge, though, is virtualization doesn't exist in isolation. So we are casting a wider net, but we're actively culling it, as you will, and trying to identify the areas. Michaela also referenced that we would like to, maybe do some synchronization with some of the other working groups that are not bounded just by virtualization, so we don't miss anything. But the intent is absolutely to put a virtualization lens on this very broad landscape and really highlight those areas and focus on them.
I would also like to add that we are looking at the same things, but also from a positive perspective in terms of what we can leverage virtualization to actually improve security in some of these conditions that existed before virtualization, as John mentioned. So there are perhaps due to virtualization, but there are also a lot of benefits from virtualization that some of the risks before can be mitigated much better.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? All right, let's move on to working group 1, please.
Thanks, Suzanne. This is Travis Russell from Oracle Communications. I'm co-chair of Working Group 1, along with Brian Daly from AT&T. So I'll cover the first set of slides, and then Brian will step in and talk about our status. So next slide, please. So our charter is to look at the vulnerabilities that have been identified around the protocol of HTTP2. I need more coffee this time of day. HTTP2 is the protocol that is being used for signaling within the 5G network. So analogous to what we discussed in previous CSRICs around SO7 and diameter in the 5G world, we use HTTP2 today, and then this will evolve to HTTP3 in later releases. So we are looking at the vulnerabilities specific to HTTP2, but more importantly, we're looking at this in the context of a 5G network. Obviously, there are vulnerabilities in HTTP2 that can be exploited on an open internet, but when we start looking at a closed network, such as the case in 5G networks, it becomes a little bit different. So we are examining it from that context. Next slide, please. There were some vulnerabilities that were provided to us by the FCC, 4 of them namely. So slow read attacks, HPAC bombs, dependency cycle attacks, and stream multiplexing abuse. So we are looking at these as well, and we will be reporting on their impacts, again, in a 5G context, as we look at other possible vulnerabilities and attack vectors. We are getting presentations from subject matter experts on this. There's not a lot of subject matter experts on HTTP2 in a 5G context, so that has become a bit of a challenge, but we have a pretty capable working group that's able to address this. So next slide. The working group has a pretty diverse set of organizations that are represented besides Oracle and AT&T. We've also got TIA and CTA. We've got Verizon and Cox, Nokia, SIA, VeriSign, WBA, Palo Alto Networks, Addis, T-Mobile, Mavenir, Somos, Ericsson, Andro, FEMA, CISA, and CTIA. So a pretty good mixture here, I believe, within the working group. The next slide. And then, of course, we have some alternates that step in the absence of the actual working group members. And so, again, a lot of expertise is represented here. We have seen a bit of attrition, if you will. We lost one member who resigned. Next slide. But we're very sad to say that we lost a very valuable member, not just to Working Group 1, but also to our CSRIC community. And that was John Kimmons, who passed suddenly in February. I've worked with John in previous CSRICs, always been a valuable contributor to all of the work that we've done here in CSRIC. So our condolences go to John, his family and friends. And with that, Brian, you want to take on the next slide?
Yeah, thank you, Travis. So going into our Working Group 1 deliverables and schedule, we are having bi-weekly virtual meetings at this point, and likely that cadence will increase as the work progresses and we see the need to have additional meetings. We are doing research and examining the security vulnerabilities and attack vectors as laid out in our charter. We do have a report due in September of this year on security vulnerabilities in HTTP2. And our second report in June of 23 will be a report on best practices to mitigate those vulnerabilities, both in HTTP2 as well as HTTP3. Next slide, please. As far as the status of the work, as Travis noted, we are trying to identify subject matter experts that we can bring in that are doing research in this topic. We have received 2 presentations so far from researchers on 2 topics. The first was a presentation on research that was given at Black Cat on potential HTTP vulnerabilities. And the second presentation was on research to the GSMA on network slicing vulnerabilities. We are discussing OAuth and other linked vulnerabilities and how it relates to HTTP2. And that work will, again, lead up to our report later this year. So with that, if we turn to the next slide, that opens it up to any discussion, and I'll invite Travis and myself for any questions or discussion.
Jason?
Hi, thank you. Yes, I just want to, Travis, first off, long time no see. It's been, what, 5 or 6 days? I want to say just not a question, but a comment. Thank you so much for acknowledging the contributions and untimely loss of John Kimmons. I've worked very closely with him for the better part of the past 2 decades, and our community is less off because of his passing. Just thank you so much for mentioning that.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, if we could move to Working Group 2, promoting security, reliability, and interoperability of ORAN equipment with Mike Barnes and George Woodward.
Hi, it's Mike Barnes. George is also on the call, but he has limited access right now due to a major snowstorm he's involved in. So he'll speak up and be able to answer questions at the end. Thank you. And go to the next slide. So our focus, and this is the same as we discussed in the last meeting, but our focus is on ORAN security, so interoperability, reliability, and security for ORAN. If you go to the next slide. So it's a couple of objectives. One is to basically look at, is there, the increased threat attack surface? What are the threats that are brought with ORAN? How do we mitigate those? And as well to help recommend to the FCC how to work with standards bodies and other groups, regulatory bodies, to promote the security, interoperability, and reliability of Open RAN. Next slide. Our working group, as with other groups, we have very strong membership from suppliers and operators and government agencies and so on. It's a really strong group. Many people have been involved in other standards groups and regulatory activities. Membership's been fairly stable. Next slide. And as well, alternates strong. We heard from Brian earlier, or just a moment ago. We have other folks here that are also quite strong, and our alternates have been participating in some ways in the group, so it's been very good. Next slide. So at a high level, we're preparing our first draft of the paper for June 7th. 13th September, we want to have an internal full review, and then we're planning to deliver around mid-November. It's due in December, but December gets extremely busy, and so we are planning to internally have it ready mid-November, the paper and the overview slides. Now, we are meeting bi-weekly now. We had several experts come in, and we have another meeting planned for experts to discuss presentations on various topics. They've covered like AI, machine learning. They had some overviews of the technology, and we have another presentation coming up soon on just basically helping educate us and fill in gaps in the working group's knowledge. We've identified 6 focus areas, and we have subgroups or sub-teams that are attacking those. Some of the teams have met several times already. Some are just preparing to meet. Our goal is in the next 2 weeks to ensure that each of the subgroups, the 6 groups, has met and is starting on the gathering at least the bullet items, and in some cases even beginning to write their papers. There are some overlaps, as mentioned earlier today, about reaching out to other working groups. And so we're looking at some of the overlaps we'll have is like with supply chain, for example, and we'll reach out to the working group that's dealing with supply chain and make sure we're consistent in the message, or if we have a different message, we at least discuss that and ensure that it makes sense if we have a different way of looking at things. And next slide, or is that the last one? Okay, yeah, and we'll continue in our work. I already mentioned this. I kind of covered this. This says 7 areas. We actually combined 2 of them into one, so we now actually have 6 topic areas. So, George, did you have anything to add?
No, actually, Mike, I think you blew through it pretty well. We've developed a decent cadence. As Mike said, we've got a great group. The subgroups are actually interacting and beginning to produce on their own, so it's going very, very well. Off to a good start.
Yep. So, any questions?
I don't see that anyone's got their hand raised. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And move to working group 4, 911 service over Wi-Fi with Mary Boyd and Mark Reddish.
Good afternoon or good morning for wherever you're at. So thank you. For working group 4, we're tasked with exploring the, next slide, please. We're tasked with exploring the public safety benefits, technical feasibility, and cost of options for making Wi-Fi access points and/or unlicensed spectrum available to the public to facilitate access to 911 services. Next slide, please. So under that umbrella of 911 over Wi-Fi, we're examining a number of issues: voice and text communication, security issues, obtaining accurate location information for the 911 caller and effective call routing, prioritizing 911 calls over other types of traffic, and related issues such as standards and costs with these capabilities. Next slide, please. We're very fortunate to have a large group of talented subject matter experts with diverse backgrounds. We have SMEs for manufacturers of smartphones and Wi-Fi routers, wireless carriers, 911 service providers, and those who understand public safety operations as well. Next slide, please. And many of our participants do have alternates. Next slide, please. So our final report will be due in March of 2023. And to develop the report, we've established sub-teams to divide the work. We have a team focused on technical feasibility issues, a team focused on public safety benefits, and we have tentative plans to form a team to focus on costs after we have more information about the options to enhance 911 over Wi-Fi capabilities. Next slide, please. So to provide a little insight into what the sub-teams are working on right now, start with the technical feasibility team. They're looking at current network architectures and call flows and use case definitions primarily. So in other words, I think we need to understand the way that 911 calls over Wi-Fi are being delivered today and how they can be delivered today. You know, really understand what are the rules for 911 over Wi-Fi, and then we'll have a map of what rules could be changed to enhance the ability to place 911 calls over Wi-Fi. One of the key issues to examine as an example would be determining the location of a 911 caller, because one of the key differences between a 911 call made over the cellular network or over Wi-Fi is that with Wi-Fi calls, you don't have that traditional mechanism for routing by the cell sector that's carrying the wireless call. So the team looking at technical issues is being very thorough, and I think there'll be some interesting and impactful recommendations. Next slide, please. The team looking at public safety benefits is working in parallel to the technical feasibility team. These groups hold separate calls, but we also get together as a full group regularly so that we're all on the same page and working in a complementary fashion. The public safety benefits team's initial focus is also entailed reviewing use cases. And again, I'd explain this as understanding what the rules are now for 911 calls carried over Wi-Fi and what changes or enhancements could be beneficial for public safety. It's been helpful to have a group focused on the public safety benefits because the landscape of issues for 911 over Wi-Fi is so vast that having this perspective of what features or enhancements could be most beneficial for public safety should make it easier to prioritize the various technical issues that are being considered. And as with the technical feasibility team, I certainly want to compliment the team examining public safety benefits for their thorough work so far. Let's see, next slide, please. So our working group members are continuing regular meetings and we're on track to deliver the report on time. And finally, I want to thank our liaison from the FCC, Rasul Safavian, for his dedication, a lot of support to the groups. And let me see, Mary Boyd, do you have anything to add?
No, Mark, thank you. I believe you covered it for us. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much.
Are there any questions? This is a great meeting to ask questions since we have a fairly light agenda. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it, Mark. Let's move on to Working Group 5, Managing Software and Cloud Services, Supply Chain Security for Communications Infrastructure with Ritwick.
Hello, my name's Todd Gibson. I'll be presenting on behalf of Ritwick today. So,
Great. Welcome, Todd. Thank you.
Hey, no worries. If you could, next slide. And next slide. So, so the group is, well, go back one slide. I'll just make sure we're all on the same page. I skipped ahead real quick. So this is the supply chain working group. It has been referenced. We are looking at or being challenged to look at the managing the software and the cloud services supply chain security for communications infrastructure. And so if you could now go to the next slide. And the big ask that's coming in is particularly, what are the risks associated with the service provider's operations from attacks and the service provider's software and cloud services stacks? And the ask is also to develop the mitigation strategies for those vulnerabilities, including, the best practices to mitigate them. And the challenge is that, the supply chain vertical, if you want to call it, is so broad. It's from hardware to software to cloud services, you name it. But the one thing that the the FCC is asking us for, the chairwoman is also how does this compare to large and small service providers, as well as large and small software vendors and large and small cloud service providers. So I think, the ask is, that some of these larger operations or larger vendors or companies can have a little bit deeper pockets to maybe do a little bit more in that space in order to develop stronger mitigation strategies, where some of the smaller organizations may not have that same luxury to be able to do that. So next slide. So our milestones, at least the two that we have, is a report on the recommended best practices to improve communication supply chain security. The report is due in September. We're going to deliver it in August, 3 weeks ahead, and then also in June of 2023, we'll deliver a recommended best practices to improve supply chain security of infrastructure and network management systems. Next slide. And like others, we do have a very strong group of working members from both, private enterprise, as well as service providers, as well as government agencies as well. The participation has been very good. The level of engagement from the various working members has also been very good as well. It's been very interactive. Next slide. And then we also have a good list of alternates, both from private enterprise as well as government agencies and service providers. Next slide. So, like I mentioned, we do have a report to deliver this August, and it's going to be the final report. It's going to be in September. We are working on that report, and we are meeting every 2 weeks. And there's some of us, a handful, that are definitely probably almost in daily communications at the same time. So it's good. So next slide. So for the August 2022 report that we've got to deliver, we do have a draft outline already drafted and I don't want to say completed, but it's mostly drafted. The co-rapporteurs are myself from T-Mobile and Dick Tenney from DHS CISA. And then we also have drafted up, some of our members have drafted up a report on SolarWinds. Again, part of the motivation from the FCC, from what they've requested, is some of the recent breaches of trusted vendors. And so we are taking into account, and given how broad the supply chain vertical is, we are being a little bit more methodical in the sense of, what is it that, these recent breaches, what are they? What can we learn from them? And how can we take those into the ask of the chairwoman and then develop those into this August report? So we did get a SolarWinds section that has been drafted, as well as work group reviewed. We do have draft sections on Log4j and CASIA, the VSA, that has been drafted and is still going through some small group peer review that is slated for broader working group review. We're also in the process of further defining the scope of the definitions. The scope definitions are underway because, again, it is a broad topic. We have had 3 of our members from ADIS give us, Tom Anderson from ADIS gave us an update on their recent September 2021 supply chain white paper they delivered, as well as Claire gave us an update on the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee paper that went in front of the president back in November, as well as Henry Young gave us a BSA framework overview. And then we've also invited Alec Friedman from CISA to come give us an update on SBOM. And so we are taking a lot of that into consideration. We've also have identified We requested the work group members to go through the executive order from last May, as well as look at the Secretary of Commerce's and the Director of NIST and the Secretary of Homeland Security's responses to that executive order that have all published some documents that we need to also review. And then we've also have outlined the NIST software supply chain security, as well as GSMA Nessus, as well as the 5G Americas published a paper back in December that included quite a bit on the software supply chain, as well as the security framework. And then also the CISA has also published an information and communications technology supply chain risk management task force. They've published some information as well. So we are trying to look more broadly as we develop, and I call it the storming and forming. We're still at that stage, but we are making progress while we're trying to absorb as much as we can and get everything on the table so we can start doing it. We do have some draft subgroups that we're kind of banting about between Ritwick and myself and Dick Tenney on some opportunities to further divide the group to make them a bite size so we can get a little bit more narrow focus for individual work group members so we can start dividing and conquering for that August report. So, next slide. And that's it. So any questions? All right, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Todd. We appreciate it. And now we are moving on to the last presentation, which is from Working Group 6 on leveraging mobile device applications and firmware to enhance WIA. Looks like, Francisco, you're going to be, you're going to be presenting.
Yes, and thank you, Susan. Yes, I will be presenting on behalf of myself for KTB with Qualcomm, and also we have Francisco Sanchez with U.S. Small Business Administration on the call, so we can answer any questions. And of course, we have James Wiley, our FCC liaison. So in the way of background, you may know that U.S. is leading deployment of and availability of wireless emergency alert VIA in the world. And the one aspect of wireless emergency alert VIA is that it's text-based. So the highlighted yellow text talks about how it would be good to leverage some of the aspects in the device and smartphone to enable things like map and so forth in collaboration with the existing VIA. And as well as the text in the blue talks about how some sort of accessibility features that are available in the device can be used in combination with VIA messages to enable better access by those who have access and functional needs. Next slide, please. So the objective of working group is to take a look at what we have in VIA and define some application programming interfaces, APIs, to enable some of the device capabilities, parameters to potentially the VIA application. So what we have in VIA and what we have with APIs to see what we can do to enable what I mentioned in the previous slide. And there's a pictorial here that shows how potentially a map can be shown that has the alert area, and that would help someone understand what direction potentially they want to drive to get out of that alert area. Next slide, please. So we have one report. We may actually have a second report we may ask, but for the time being, we have one report that's due March 2023. So we have about a year to do that. Next slide, please. And as others mentioned, the work cannot be done without great effort by all the working members. And I got to tell you, I mean, this is one of the first time that I see almost all working group members participate every meeting and every discussion. So we really appreciate participation and input by all the working members. Next slide, please. Also, of course, we have some alternates, and sometimes we have actually these alternates provide some very valuable, just as valuable input as the members. Next slide, please. So we are meeting right now every other week, but we may actually increase the cadence as we get closer to the deadline. But I think we are coasting in a pretty good way, and there are lots of discussion offline between the meetings. Next slide, please. So what's the latest status that we have? So we had we had a good review of the existing VIA parameters that are available in the handset. We also had presentations to understand what are the what are the APIs in the handset from both Android devices as well as iOS devices. Also now, one of the things that we are very much engaged in, and it's been really good, interesting discussion, is a compiling list of relevant use cases. So we want to make sure that we understand what are those use cases that we may require these APIs. And part of the work that we are doing, we are analyzing these use cases to see if some of them can be supported by exposing existing VIA parameters to the secure application, or perhaps may require enhancement to the existing VIA, for example, new parameters and so forth, or maybe require major changes in existing VIA, or require alternative alerting techniques, or they're beyond the scope of VIA altogether. So we are inviting all the use cases at this stage, and what we will do is categorize these use cases with the understanding that some of these use cases may require additional standard policy and legislative changes, and some of the use cases may be completely outside the scope of CSRIC 8 Working Group 6, but with respect to all the input that we are getting, and we appreciate all the use cases coming from Alert Originator and others, we would like to capture all those use cases and make sure that we have a good catalog of use cases. Next slide, please. So we're going to continue our bi-weekly meetings and continue doing our use case analysis and understand how those would interact with the APIs that we are working on, and obviously provide a periodic status update to the steering committee and council. I believe that's the last one. Next slide, please. So Suzanne, with that, perhaps, I don't know if Francisco, would you like to add anything?
Just, I think that summarizes it, Farouk. Thanks for the great update, and we're getting some progress done, so I appreciate it.
Thank you. So Suzanne, back to you to see if there are any questions. I think
it looks like Stephen Hayes. Yes, yep. Right. Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned APIs. I assume that you're just sort of developing a high-level principles document, and that would be transferred to ATIS or some standards organization or somebody else to actually do the detailed work. Is that sort of the plan?
Yes, that's a correct understanding. So the detailed technical work will be done elsewhere, for example, as ATIS, as you mentioned. But what we want to understand, what are the APIs available today? How can we take advantage of those? And what are potential new APIs that we need? So that's this API discussion that we have to kind of scope the work before we send it to standard bodies like ATIS. Great question. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Billy Bob, would you like to make some comments? I think you're on mute.
Try again. How about now?
There we go. Thanks.
Great. So I would like to thank all the working group leads on the great efforts and work that's been done so far. It looks as though there's a great amount of work that's been done. You all are settling into a very good rhythm, and it's been very exciting to see the progress that's been made against these requirements to submit recommendations. So continue to press ahead as the spring comes around, and hopefully that provides a little more energy to the team to continue on.
Thank you. And thank you all for attending. I would just like to note that the next meeting is on June 15th at 1. And does anyone have any questions? Great, then I would like to announce that the third meeting of CSRIC 8 is officially closed. Thank you all.